In March 1985, when Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the USSR was not collapsing in a single dramatic moment. It was grinding down. The country still looked, on paper, like a superpower, a nuclear arsenal comparable to the United States, a vast industrial base, a disciplined party state, and a sphere of influence stretching across Eastern Europe. But beneath the slogans and parades, the Soviet system was running on exhaustion, inertia, and a kind of institutional self-deception that had become routine. The old leadership had died in sequence: Leonid Brezhnev in 1982, Yuri Andropov in 1984, Konstantin Chernenko in March 1985, leaving behind a gerontocratic image and a state with deep structural problems. Low productivity, technological lag, chronic shortages, and a war in Afghanistan that was swallowing men and money. Gorbachev's arrival signaled youth and movement. He was 54, startlingly young by Kremlin standards, and, with him, came a promise that life could be made to work again. What life in the USSR under Gorbachev was really like is inseparable from that promise, because his era was experienced as acceleration. A sudden change in pace that first felt like reform, then like instability, and finally like the ground giving way. To understand the atmosphere ordinary Soviet citizens lived in from 1985 to 1991, you have to understand what the Soviet state had been asking of them for decades. It promised full employment, subsidized housing, cheap utilities, and a sense of global mission. In return, it demanded political conformity, patience with shortages, and acceptance of a managed truth. By the early 1980s, that bargain was fraying. Economic growth had slowed sharply. The oil windfalls of the 1970s could not mask the inefficiencies forever. The Soviet-planned economy could produce rockets and tanks, but it struggled to supply decent shoes, fresh meat, or reliable consumer goods. People developed survival skills, knowing which store received deliveries, cultivating connections, bartering favors, standing in line because a rumor said something had arrived. The black market and informal economy were not marginal. They were a parallel system that made daily life possible. And the state, despite its surveillance and propaganda, increasingly depended on citizens' cynicism to keep the peace. Most people did not believe the newspapers, but they also did not expect the system to change. Gorbachev entered this landscape with two words that became the signature of his rule: perestroika, meaning restructuring, and glasnost, meaning openness. These were not mere slogans. They were policy directions that would change what people could say, what they could read, what they could watch, and eventually what they could do politically. But at the beginning, the change was not freedom in the abstract. It was the state trying to repair itself. Gorbachev and allies like Alexander Yakovlev believed the USSR had to modernize, and they believed the main obstacle was not simply economic technique, but political stagnation, a system that punished initiative, rewarded obedience, and concealed failure. The first shock to everyday life under Gorbachev came not from a liberal reform, but from a campaign that felt like a moral crackdown. In May 1985, the Soviet leadership launched a major anti-alcohol campaign, restricting sales, raising prices, cutting production, and even destroying vineyards in some regions. Alcoholism was a real crisis. Vodka consumption was massive, and alcohol-related deaths were high, but the campaign had immediate consequences that millions felt in the most mundane way. Long lines outside liquor stores, rationing by hours, and an explosion of samogon, homemade alcohol, as people found ways around restrictions. The state lost enormous revenue from alcohol sales, worsening fiscal pressures, while the public's resentment grew. The campaign revealed a pattern that would define the era. The leadership recognized real problems, acted abruptly, and then struggled to control the unintended effects. If you lived in a Soviet city in 1986, you could feel the system shifting, but you could also feel how fragile it was. Perestroika began with attempts to increase discipline and efficiency, tightening labor rules, fighting corruption, demanding better performance. But the deeper reforms required loosening centralized controls, and that meant threatening the power of the ministries and the party apparatus that managed everything. Gorbachev's early years were a tug-of-war between reformers and entrenched interests, and that struggle filtered down into daily life as confusion. Policies changed, slogans changed, priorities changed. People heard promises of acceleration uscorny, then restructuring, then democratization. The language of politics became more dynamic, but the shops did not magically fill. Then, on 26 April 1986, the event occurred that would do more than any speech to redefine the relationship between the Soviet state and its citizens. Reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, near Pripyat in the Ukrainian SSR, exploded during a safety test. The disaster was not just a technological failure. It was a systemic failure, produced by design flaws in the RBMK reactor, by a culture of secrecy, by pressure to meet targets, and by a hierarchy that discouraged bad news traveling upward. In the first hours and days, Soviet authorities responded with the reflexes of the old system: minimize, conceal, control information. Pripyat, a city of roughly 50,000, was not immediately evacuated. The evacuation began about 36 hours after the explosion. Firefighters and plant workers, many of whom had no idea what they were facing, fought the blaze and absorbed lethal doses of radiation. The Soviet Union did mobilize enormous resources. Hundreds of thousands of liquidators would eventually be involved in containment and cleanup, but the political damage was irreversible. Radiation did not respect borders, and when Swedish monitoring stations detected abnormal radiation levels, the USSR could not keep the story contained. The state that had always insisted it was in control was suddenly exposed, literally, as vulnerable and evasive. For ordinary people, Chernobyl changed the texture of reality. It made the abstract fear of nuclear catastrophe physical. It also made the state's information monopoly look not merely paternalistic, but dangerous. Under glasnost, the disaster became a catalyst for more open discussion of problems previously hidden: industrial accidents, environmental degradation, corruption, and the human cost of state decisions. Gorbachev later described Chernobyl as a turning point, and in terms of public trust it was. In the months after the explosion, Soviet citizens watched a strange duality. On one hand, the state still staged May Day parades in 1986, including in Kiev, even as radiation fears spread. On the other hand, the press slowly began to acknowledge what had happened. That gap between ritual normality and creeping truth became a defining psychological experience of the Gorbachev years. By 1987, perestroika began moving from slogans towards structural change. The law on state enterprise, adopted in 1987, attempted to give enterprises more autonomy, shifting them towards self-financing and allowing them to respond to demand rather than simply fulfill planned targets. In theory, it was a step toward efficiency. In practice, it collided with the reality that prices were still largely fixed by the state, supply chains were still planned, and managers were still navigating political constraints. Enterprises could gain more freedom to spend, but they could not easily buy what they needed. The result was often chaos: hoarding, breakdowns in distribution, and worsening shortages. The Soviet economy was being partially loosened without a functioning market mechanism to replace the plan, and people felt that in the simplest ways: empty shelves, unpredictable availability, the sense that the old certainty, however bleak, was evaporating. At the same time, the Soviet Union under Gorbachev became more verbally alive than it had been in decades. Glasnost was not just a policy, it was a cultural earthquake. Censorship eased, and previously banned works began to appear. Newspapers and journals published investigations and criticisms that would have been unthinkable under Brezhnev. The magazine Ogoniok, under editor Vitaly Koratich, became a symbol of the new openness, printing stories about Stalinist crimes, corruption, and social problems. Films that confronted Soviet history and contemporary malaise reached audiences more openly. People gathered around televisions for programs that felt like revelations, because for the first time the state was allowing a controlled form of honesty, and honesty is addictive. Once people saw that the official narrative could be challenged, the legitimacy of the entire system became a topic of conversation, not just in kitchens, but in public. This shift in speech did not mean the USSR became a liberal democracy overnight. The KGB still existed, and political power still belonged to the Communist Party. But the boundaries moved, and the moving boundary created a new kind of tension. Citizens learned, in real time, what could now be said and what still could not. The fear that had shaped Soviet public life did not vanish, it mutated. People tested limits. Writers, journalists, and activists pushed. Some officials retaliated, others adapted. The country's psychological climate became unstable because the rules were no longer clear. In foreign policy, Gorbachev's decisions also reshaped domestic life. The USSR had been spending staggering resources on the military and on sustaining its Eastern Bloc allies. The arms race with the United States, especially intensified in the early 1980s, strained an economy already struggling. Gorbachev's approach, often called New Thinking, aimed to reduce tensions and shift resources away from confrontation. In December 1987, Gorbachev and US President Ronald Reagan signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in Washington, eliminating an entire class of nuclear missiles. This was not just diplomacy. It was a signal that the Cold War's tempo could change. For Soviet citizens, it meant the leadership was openly acknowledging that the previous trajectory was unsustainable. The image of the USSR as an unyielding fortress began to soften, and for some that was relief, while for others, especially within the military and conservative party circles, it was betrayal. The most consequential foreign policy decisions of the era was the end of the Soviet war in Afghanistan. The USSR had invaded Afghanistan in December 1979, and by the mid-1980s, the war was widely recognized as a costly quagmire. Soviet casualties totaled around 15,000 dead over the course of the conflict, with many more wounded, and the war produced a generation of veterans, the Afghansi, who returned with trauma and disillusionment. Gorbachev called the war a bleeding wound, and under his leadership, the USSR signed the Geneva Accords in 1988 and completed the withdrawal by February 1989. For families across the Soviet Union, the return of conscripts and the end of the war were deeply tangible events. But the withdrawal also carried a political message. The Soviet state was no longer willing or able to impose its will by force indefinitely. That message would echo across Eastern Europe. If you want to understand what life under Gorbachev felt like, you have to see the simultaneous expansion and contraction happening in people's lives. The expansion was in speech, information, and political possibility. The contraction was in material stability. The late Soviet economy had always been inefficient, but under Gorbachev it became unpredictable. By 1988 and 1989, shortages worsened. Queues became longer and more desperate. Basic goods, meat, butter, sugar, soap could be hard to find. Rationing returned in various forms in different regions. People spent hours standing in line, not knowing what would be available at the end. The line itself became a social institution, a place where rumors spread, where anger simmered, where political talk became more open because frustration made people less cautious. Under Brezhnev, the system's stagnation was stable. Under Gorbachev, the system's reform was unstable. In 1988, the Soviet state took a step that seemed revolutionary. The law on cooperatives allowed private cooperative businesses in services, manufacturing, and restaurants. This was the most significant opening to private enterprise since Lenin's new economic policy in the 1920s. In Soviet cities, cooperatives appeared as new cafes, repair shops, and small ventures. For some citizens, they were exciting signs of normal life places where you could actually buy something without pleading with a clerk or bribing a manager. For others, they were symbols of inequality and corruption, because cooperatives often charged high prices and were sometimes connected to officials who used influence to secure supplies. The cooperative movement created visible wealth in a society that had long claimed to be egalitarian, and that visibility changed the moral atmosphere. People who had spent their lives in a world where money mattered less than connections now saw money becoming openly powerful. The Soviet state, while still officially socialist, was generating the early conditions for the post-Soviet oligarchic landscape. Networks of privilege learning how to convert administrative power into economic power. Politically, the most dramatic shift came with the creation of a new legislative body and competitive elections. In 1989, the USSR held elections for the Congress of People's Deputies, a new institution created as part of Gorbachev's constitutional reforms. For the first time in Soviet history, there were elements of genuine electoral competition, and some candidates outside the party mainstream won seats. The sessions of the Congress were televised, and millions watched debates that were raw, confrontational, and unprecedented. Figures like Boris Yeltsin, who had been removed from his position as Moscow party chief in 1987 after criticizing the pace of reform, emerged as a populist challenger to the party establishment. Watching the Congress was, for many, like watching the state argue with itself in public. The Soviet system had always projected unity. Now it displayed division. That transparency was exhilarating, but it also eroded the aura of inevitability that had kept the Union together. As Glasnost exposed the past, it also unleashed national questions that the Soviet system had suppressed. The USSR was a multi-ethnic empire structured as a federation of republics, but in practice power was centralized in Moscow. Under Stalin, entire peoples had been deported. Under later leaders, national movements were contained by censorship and force. Under Gorbachev, as political control loosened, nationalist movements surged. In the Baltic republics Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania popular fronts formed and demanded sovereignty. On 23 August 1989, the 50th anniversary of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, approximately 2 million people joined hands in a human chain known as the Baltic Way, stretching roughly 600 kilometers from Tallinn through Riga to Vilnius. It was a demonstration of organization and unity that the Soviet state could not easily crush without revealing the limits of its own reforms. In the Caucasus, tensions turned violent. In February 1988, conflict erupted over Nagorno-Karabakh, a predominantly Armenian region within the Azerbaijan SSR, sparking demonstrations and interethnic violence. The Sumgait pogrom in late February 1988, in which Armenians were attacked in the Azerbaijani city of Sumgait, became a symbol of how quickly suppressed tensions could explode. These were not abstract political disputes. They affected daily life through fear, displacement, and the sense that the Soviet promise of friendship of peoples was breaking apart. The most important point is that Gorbachev did not simply allow these forces. He lost the ability to contain them with the old tools, because using those tools would contradict the legitimacy of his reform project and risk civil conflict. Yet not using them meant the center's authority weakened. Life under Gorbachev was lived inside that contradiction, a state trying to be more humane and lawful while confronting problems that the old state had previously managed through coercion and silence. In Eastern Europe, the consequences of Gorbachev's new thinking were seismic. For decades, the Soviet Union had enforced its dominance through the Brezhnev Doctrine, intervening when socialist regimes were threatened, as in Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968. Under Gorbachev, that doctrine effectively died. In 1989, communist regimes across Eastern Europe began to fall, and crucially, the Red Army did not roll in to save them. Poland held partially free elections in June 1989, leading to a non-communist-led government. Hungary opened its border with Austria, allowing East Germans to flee west. In November 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, a moment that became an icon of the century. By 1990, East Germany was on the path to reunification with West Germany, which was formally completed on 3 October 1990. For Soviet citizens watching from afar, these events were disorienting. The USSR had defined itself partly through its victory in World War II and its status as the guardian of a socialist bloc. Now that bloc was dissolving, and the Soviet leadership was not stopping it. Some felt pride at the reduction of tension. Others felt humiliation and fear that the USSR itself would be next. Inside the Soviet Union, the economy continued to deteriorate. The reforms had undermined the old command mechanisms without creating a stable new system. By 1990, the crisis was visible everywhere. Production fell, budget deficits grew, and the ruble was increasingly meaningless as a measure of real value. People relied more heavily on personal networks, barter, and second jobs. The gap between official wages and actual purchasing power widened. In some places, strikes erupted, notably among coal miners in 1989 in regions like the Kuzbas and Donbass, demanding better conditions and political changes. The miners' strikes were significant because they were not marginal dissidents. They were core industrial workers, the supposed base of Soviet power. When the workers who were meant to embody socialism began to openly challenge the state, it signaled a legitimacy crisis at the heart of the system. The political center fractured further as republics asserted sovereignty. In June 1990, the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, led increasingly by Boris Yeltsin, declared state sovereignty, asserting the primacy of Russian laws over Soviet laws. This was a turning point because Russia was not just another republic, it was the core of the Union. If Russia itself claimed sovereignty, the USSR's legal and political structure became untenable. Lithuania declared the restoration of independence on 11 March 1990, and Moscow responded with economic pressure and later force. In January 1991, Soviet troops and special units moved in Lithuania and Latvia. In Vilnius, at the TV tower, 14 civilians were killed on 13 January 1991. The images of Soviet force used against unarmed demonstrators were broadcast widely and further damaged Gorbachev's standing, both domestically and internationally. The state was now trapped between reform and repression, and every attempt to reassert control seemed to accelerate disintegration. For ordinary Soviet citizens, 1990 and 1991 were experienced as a narrowing of daily life. The political world was loud, and dramatic newspapers full of revelations, televised debates, rallies, but the material world was increasingly empty. Stores had less. Lines got longer. People hoarded what they could. Anxiety became normal. The Soviet social guarantees still existed on paper, but their reliability eroded. The sense of time changed. Not the slow, predictable stagnation of the 1970s, but a rapid, unstable present where tomorrow's rules might not match today's. It is difficult to overstate how psychologically exhausting that was. Glasnost had opened the archives of memory Stalin's terror, mass grave, the Gulag, the crimes that families had whispered about. Perestroika had opened the economy just enough to destabilize it. The combination meant people were confronting both historical trauma and present scarcity at the same time. Gorbachev attempted to hold the country together through a new union treaty that would transform the USSR into a looser federation. A referendum on preserving the union was held on 17 March 1991. In the republics that participated, a majority voted in favor of preserving a renewed federation, though several republics, including the Baltic states, Georgia, Armenia, and Moldova, did not participate. The referendum result showed something crucial. Many citizens did not necessarily want the Soviet Union to vanish into chaos. They wanted stability, reform, and dignity. But the political forces unleashed by the previous years were already too strong, and the state's capacity to enforce a compromise was too weak. The final act of life under Gorbachev arrived in August 1991, and it arrived as a coup. On 19 August 1991, hardline officials formed the State Committee on the State of Emergency, attempting to seize power while Gorbachev was at his dacha in Foros, Crimea. The plotters included figures like Gennady Yanev, who declared himself acting president, and they claimed they were acting to prevent the disintegration of the USSR. Tanks entered Moscow. The coup was a desperate attempt to restore the old order, but it revealed how hollow that order had become. Boris Yeltsin, by then president of the Russian Republic, emerged as the central figure of resistance, famously standing on a tank outside the Russian White House and calling for defiance. Hundreds of thousands of Muscovites mobilized, building barricades and confronting soldiers. The coup collapsed within days. By 21 August, after parts of the military refused to support it and the plotters lost nerve. 3 young men were killed near a tunnel on the Garden Ring during the confrontation, and their deaths became symbols of the moment. The coup's failure did not save the Soviet Union. It destroyed what remained of the Communist Party's authority and accelerated the transfer of power to the republics, especially Russia under Yeltsin. The Communist Party was suspended in Russia. Its property was seized. The Union Treaty became irrelevant. Republic after republic declared independence. On 8 December 1991, leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus Yeltsin, Leonid Kravchuk, and Stanislav Shushkevich signed the Belovej Accords, declaring that the USSR no longer existed and creating the Commonwealth of Independent States. On 25 December 1991, Gorbachev resigned as president of the Soviet Union. The Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin, replaced by the Russian tricolor. The state that had shaped the lives of its citizens for nearly 70 years ended not with a single final battle, but with a sequence of political decisions made under pressure in a country whose institutions had stopped functioning coherently. So what was life in the USSR under Gorbachev really like? It was not simply freer, and it was not simply worse. It was a collision between awakening and collapse. It was the experience of watching forbidden truths become public knowledge while the basic mechanisms of daily provisioning broke down. It was the sensation of history accelerating, of seeing the Soviet system argue with itself on live television, of reading about Stalinist terror in mainstream publications, of watching Eastern Europe slip away without Soviet tanks returning, of hearing new political voices and new national demands, and then going to a store and finding nothing on the shelves. It was the destabilizing realization that the state could be wrong, could lie, could fail, and could even disappear. The deeper context behind Gorbachev's major decisions is that he was trying to solve a problem that may not have had a solvable middle path. The Soviet command economy and one-party political structure had produced industrial power and military might, but they had also produced rigidity, secrecy, and a brittle legitimacy. Perestroika aimed to introduce dynamism without surrendering control. Glasnost aimed to restore trust through openness without unleashing forces that would destroy the Union. Chernobyl demonstrated the lethal cost of secrecy. Economic reform demonstrated the danger of partial liberalization without stable institutions. Political reform demonstrated that once people are allowed to choose, even in limited ways, they begin to question why choices were ever restricted. National movements demonstrated that the Soviet federal structure, held together by centralized power, could not easily survive genuine sovereignty. And the end of the Brezhnev Doctrine demonstrated that the USSR could not maintain an empire abroad while reforming at home. The long-term effects of Gorbachev's era were immediate and enduring. The collapse of the USSR reshaped global geopolitics, ending the Cold War's bipolar structure. For the post-Soviet states, it opened paths to independence, but also to economic shock, political turmoil, and conflicts that still reverberate. The early 1990s brought severe hardship for many former Soviet citizens, and the memory of that hardship became a powerful political force in later decades. The opening of archives and public discussion under Glasnost permanently changed historical consciousness, making denial of past crimes harder to sustain, even when later governments tried to reassert control over narratives. The weakening of central authority and the rise of figures like Yeltsin set the stage for the political struggles of post-Soviet Russia, including the later consolidation of power in the Kremlin. The national conflicts that flared in the late Soviet period, Nagorno-Karabakh, Baltic independence, tensions in Georgia and elsewhere, did not vanish with the Soviet flag. They became the borders and fault lines of a new era. The takeaway is not that Gorbachev caused the collapse by accident or that the USSR was stable until one man changed it. The takeaway is that by 1985, the Soviet system had accumulated contradictions it could no longer hide. An economy that could not satisfy its people, a political structure that could not tolerate truth, and an empire that could not be maintained without violence. Gorbachev tried to reform the system in order to save it. But the act of reform exposed how much had been held together by silence and force. Life under Gorbachev was the moment when millions of people realized, almost simultaneously, that the Soviet state was not eternal. And in the modern world, where information, legitimacy, and economic stability remain the foundations of power, that lesson still matters. When a state's narrative collapses faster than its institutions can adapt, history does not pause to let it catch its breath.